Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us if you're here live. Um, I'm going to get us started just because we have a lot to cover today. So I'm going to let Phil and Greg quickly introduce themselves while I get the slides set up.
All right, great. Thank you, Lindy. I'll start off, Greg, if you don't mind. I'll introduce myself, Phil Terenzi from Boston Police. I currently a captain working at the Boston Police Academy. I've been here for a little while in the Boston Police Department. I'm not even going to say how long I have been, but it's over 40 years. I've been doing ABLE since 2020. I was in the second class of ABLE, and I am excited to be on the national team. I'm honored to be here today to talk a little bit about some of the things that I've learned over the years. And we did our in service, and we had taught over 95 sessions here in the Boston Police Department. So whatever I gained both here as well as nationally, I'm looking forward to share with everybody today. Greg?
Awesome. Well, Phil, it's great to be alongside you. My name is Greg Henner Jr. I'm one of the national trainers here for ABLE. It is my absolute honor to be here today to cover this topic. And just a little bit about me. I'm a retired captain, commander with the DC Metro Transit Police Department in Washington, DC. And I served 27 years on the department, retired in 2020, and came to the ABLE project December of 2020. So right when it was in the very beginning of rolling out some of the sessions. So just to kind of date it a little bit, I think our last session was 109, and I attended session number 8. So it just shows how far we have progressed and grown over the last 3 years. I am also a graduate FBI National Academy Associates, FBI NA, graduated in 2015. And I'm also on the executive board for the DC chapter of the NA. So I am excited about this session here, get to share some things that we talk about in the classroom, kind of reinforce some things. But then also I get another opportunity, even though Phil and I were together, what was it, last week, I think it was, Phil?
Yes.
Get another opportunity to hang out and teach this with my colleagues. So really appreciate being here today and looking forward to the session today, Phil.
Awesome. So I think we're getting ready to start off with the slides. So Greg, you're up first with the case study. Want to hit that up?
Yep, sounds good. Okay, so let's go to the case studies. And what we're doing today is really just going over, this is more or less kind of like a review, so to speak, but then also a couple little pointers that we're going to do. So we broke up the curriculum into different segments that we felt was important, and some of the segments that we get a lot of questions about. So we're going to kind of treat this a little bit like we're in the classroom a little bit, and we're going to first start off with the case studies. And you know, a lot of times the instructors, when we first roll this out in the trainer, they're like, oh my goodness, how am I going to remember all of this stuff? And they try to figure out how to internalize this. And so, you know, I got a couple little tips here and a couple of things that we're going to go over with each one of these case studies to remember just more or less from a high level view. Um, if you go back to some of the other learning sessions that we already have and that we've already done, we break a lot of this stuff down in finite details. This is just going to be kind of a refresher, a review, and kind of a high level review of each of the segments. And of course, we're going to be starting off here with our case studies. So we'll start off with the first one here, which is the Lopez case study. And the Lopez case study I find is extremely interesting because of all the dynamics that happen. And this is something that is that a lot of law enforcement professionals can connect with. Oftentimes when we're in the classroom, we hear people say, you know what, that Lopez case study, I think that's my my agency. And the reality of it is, it isn't. It's just that we all have some similarities to some of these things, and we can relate to the Lopez case study. So here's a couple things, first with all the case studies, and then specifically with Lopez. Instructors should remember to do what we call the setup. So in other words, as you start to introduce these case studies, just before you deliver it, talk about the fact that these case studies are real case studies. The names have been changed to protect the anonymity of the officers involved as well as the agencies involved, but they're real case studies. Also, something that is very helpful is to tell the class that you don't want them to solve the problem in a moment, but you do want them to jot down some notes because you are going to be referring back to it throughout the course of the day. And it's also a great idea, and I think the facilitator guide also kind of mentions this, but it's great to kind of also add to the setup as an enhancement to say that each one of these case studies illustrates the risks of non-intervention and represents one of the three pillars, because a little bit later on, a few slides after these case studies in the first table exercise, you're actually going to be talking about the three pillars when you start to talk about what ABLE is. All right, so let's dive a little bit into the Lopez case study. So a couple of things here. Remember the gender roles. This becomes important because as you get later into the curriculum, you start to identify the challenges or things that what we call inhibitors. And so it is important to start the process of just laying out the groundwork of the case study, and then also understanding as you're rolling it out some of these things and dynamics that are happening in this case study. And this helps you a little bit later on as you deliver this. Now, one quick thing I just want to mention, and this is kind of in the very beginning, and this is something that we oftentimes see instructors kind of fall into is as you're setting up the case study and you're delivering it, you start trying to solve the problem to some of the problems that present themselves or challenges that present themselves. So as instructors, try not to do that. All you're doing is simply delivering a case study and you're dropping a mic on it. So you're setting up the problem, you're dropping a mic on it, and you allow your students and later on in engagement to do that. And the Lopez case study has many points of that, all right? So gender roles is something that's important to keep in the back of your mind about the discussions, and it also how the case study is set up. The gender roles is absolutely a factor in there because Lopez is the only female law enforcement professional in the room, and everyone else is there as men. And if you actually do the math on how many people are there, and you include Lopez, you have roughly about 8 people in a room. And you only have one female professional. The other 2 things I want to kind of tie, not necessarily hand in hand, but it becomes important when you actually deliver this a little bit later and you start pulling out some key facts and details about the case study, is a term called diffusion responsibility and also pluralistic ignorance. Now, you'll see this in the first social science experiment. We'll talk about that segment here in a little bit, where you actually define what that pluralistic ignorance is and what diffusion responsibility really means. And so remember those 2 things, because the actual social science experiments will point back to this case study, and you'll have different engagement points throughout the curriculum to actually go more in depth into the diffusion responsibility and pluralistic ignorance. And the last thing about this that I want to make sure that we cover is that how this case study ties into the 3 pillars. So we know that 3 pillars are to reduce mistakes, prevent misconduct, promote health and wellness. This pillar is designed to be specific to the misconduct pillar. However, I do want to put an asterisk next to that level of specificity, because you can actually take all 3 of the pillars and you can probably see any one of these pillars in the Lopez case study. And I'll give you an example what that looks like. Even though curriculum-wise, this is tied into misconduct, someone may say, well, Greg, Phil, I think this is tied to the health and wellness pillar. And to some extent it is, because in the actual case study, Lopez doesn't start off upset. She doesn't start off bothered. She works her way up into it. So what were the factors that got her to that point? Could there possibly be some external things outside of law enforcement that carried over into her job that got her into a space? Could it be a form of primary and secondary trauma that impacted the ultimate outcome? So those type of things do speak into the wellness piece of it. But the way it's designed initially is the misconduct pillar. So just wanted to throw this out there for thought for the instructors to think about as you start to talk about this and to discuss this case study. All right, let's go over to the next one. And the next one is the Detective Jensen case study. Now, this Detective Jensen case study has a couple moving parts to it. And it is important that you set these things up really kind of in a sequential order, because one thing happens that leads to another thing that ultimately leads to Detective Jensen getting himself into a bad situation. One thing I want to make sure that's clear, specifically with the Detective Jensen case study, but with all of the case studies, is that your tone, your intentional pauses, and your reflection of how you deliver the case study is important. All of those things come into play because you want to emphasize certain points and certain parts of the case study. Slowing things down when a harm is created is a great way to put some emphasis and some tones. Also, having some pause points in there as you go along is also another great thing to have. So for instance, you might be delivering a case study and you pause for like a half a second to a second. That gives your students ability to be able to digest the information that you just gave them and to try to visualize what it is that you're saying audibly. So here's a couple things with the Detective Jensen case study. We know that this starts off with a situation where we have a professional, a law enforcement professional that is just that person, just burning a candle at both ends, kind of a goofball, making some inappropriate jokes, but also the one that takes all over time, gets lack of sleep, burning a candle at work, burning a candle and trying to make his personal life work. And then unfortunately, he gets himself into a really bad situation that is caught on camera. So one of the key takeaways from this is the consequences to his career and to his agency's reputation, because those two things are very important. Detective Jensen's career was derailed because of the things that he said and the things that he did leading up to the point in which he made some disparaging remarks at the scene of a homicide. But that thing was caught on video. So not only did it impact his career, but it also impacted the law enforcement profession. And then if you look at this more broadly, it impacted his agency and has an impact to the community. So while this case study does have a couple of things that kind of snowball into a bad thing, the consequences and impact can be much greater than in the moment. So those tones, inflections, and how you deliver it, and going back to the sequential order of events and how things happen becomes important. And this particular pillar is tied to the wellness pillar, promoting health and wellness. Now, again, you can tie this to other pillars because there were some mistakes that were in this. And oftentimes your students will identify those mistakes, and that is perfectly fine. As long as you're working within the confines and design of the curriculum, it works extremely well either way. And you want to promote and foster that level of discussion. So that's really with the Detective Jensen case study. There's one other quick thing I want to note with the Jensen case study too, and it's at the very end where Jensen is actually reflecting on his mistake. And in the facilitator's guide for the instructors here, it's actually in quotes. That's where it goes from narrator mode to character, which the character is Detective Jensen, and he's reflecting on what he does. That particular thing, in terms of that exchange going from narrator to actually character, is important in terms of the tone and how you deliver that segment, because now your students have to understand that I've gone from Greg Hanna telling the story to now become Detective Jensen. And this helps to set up the next segment, which is the Sergeant McDonald case study. So just wanted to throw that out there, that quick nugget. All right, let's go to Sergeant McDonald. Now, Sergeant McDonald, a lot of stuff happening in this case study, right? It's almost like fruits of the poisonous tree, so to speak, because it's a snowball effect of really small things that eventually amount to something very big, which is someone losing their life, a law enforcement professional losing their life. So here's a couple of things with this one. The other two case studies do end pretty badly for those officers, Lopez and Jensen, but this one ends tragically. So sometimes I like to give that disclaimer to prepare because my students, because in the classroom, I have actually had some students that have experienced some similar trauma to this. They've been in officer-involved shootings, and they've come up to me at lunch. They've come up to me on the breaks and said that, hey, they've been impacted by this case study. So it's important to maybe think about your audience. You all know your classrooms. You all know the majority of the people in your department, or at least a great deal of them. So kind of read the room and understand your audience, and maybe consider adding that little small disclaimer before you get started. Okay, so Sergeant McDonald case study. There were multiple chances for intervention in this. And this is the one case study that I find instructors will often try to solve the problem in the moment, because there are so many opportunities for intervention in this one. And again, fight that urge. All you want to do is set up the problem and the situation, and you drop the mic on it. All you're doing is delivering a case study. A couple things also with this one, like the other two, is the tone, inflection, and the pace in which you go through this case study. There are a lot of things that happen in this. And so you want to put those pause points, you want to put some tone to it, you want to put some inflection to it, because these things matter in this one, because it leads up to a law enforcement professional losing their life. So this is not one of those case studies, excuse me, where you just want to run through all of them. Okay. You want to make sure that you methodically go through it, not too slow, but at a good, even pace, because you want to make sure that what you're saying to your students is really illustrating the multiple chances of intervention that multiple officers on that scene, including Sergeant McDonald, recognizing what happens in this situation. You want to make it clear so they can figure that out a little bit later on this in discussion. Here's another thing about the Sergeant McDonald case study. This one has the influence of rank as the inhibitor. So in this case study, as you're delivering it, this is where your students start to internalize some of those challenges, which is inhibitors. And you're going to be talking about those inhibitors a little bit later on in the session. Just before lunch, you'll start to identify those inhibitors. And so, again, it's important that pace and that tone on how you methodically go through this. And then, of course, when you get to the end where the harm is actually created, I always encourage students and instructors to slow down at the end. Slow down, because that is the point in which an officer is losing their life because of all of the multiple mistakes that were made that led up to that point. And from a standpoint of linkage to a pillar, this particular pillar is linked to mistakes. Now, again, you can probably pull in a couple other different pillars in this. And really, all of the pillars can pull into this, but for the most part, this is tied to mistakes. So again, just overall on all three of these case studies, you want to make sure that you're speaking clearly, speak confidently. Listen, in law enforcement, we're all great storytellers. We can tell some good stories. So it's important that, you be calm and confident and clearly deliver the case study. You don't want to read right off the sheet. So we know that it's going to take some time to kind of memorize this. So start off with just some of the key points of each one of these case studies. Start to study those key points and then practice delivering them. Don't take all three case studies on at one time. Focus on one and just kind of take it in chunks and summary, and then keep going. Practice in the mirror, practice with your family members, your spouse, or whoever, or just practice to yourself. I know when I first started doing case studies, I actually practiced in the mirror because I wanted to see what my inflection was. I wanted to see what my verbal cues were. I wanted to see what my body language was as I was delivering it. And that really helped me to be better at delivering and understanding the case studies. And then lastly, you want to make sure to keep tying it back to case studies throughout the rest of the curriculum. You'll have plenty of opportunity to tie back. So you want to make sure that all you're doing is delivering it. And then as time goes on throughout the curriculum, you'll have plenty of opportunity to tie back. Some of the facilitated guide will direct you to a specific case study. Some areas of the curriculum doesn't necessarily direct you back to case study. That's perfectly fine. Wherever you see an opportunity to circle back as a part of delivering your learning objective, it's always a great idea to go back to case studies, because we can find a lot of different things in all three of these case studies. One other quick thing that worked for me before I pass this on to Phil is when you're in a classroom, I like to kind of look at the classroom, so to speak, or at least the dais part of it, as my stage. So when I'm in the classroom and I'm delivering these case studies, I'm kind of looking at that as my stage, and everyone is looking at me. So you want to get up, you want to move around, try to get away from a podium or something that's fixed, because it just looks more and sound like a lecture. Try to get out a little bit more, move around strategically, not fast in a room, project your voice in different parts of the room, and then deliver it with inflection, with tone. And that really makes a difference in how the case study is received and how you deliver it, because each one of these case studies have something specific to them that is going to be very important to teach a little bit later on or reinforce a little bit later. So that, in a nutshell, is the case studies. I want to turn this over to Phil. And I think, Phil, you got the other successful bystandership programs and professions, correct?
Right. So, great job of, letting people know about those pillars and which ones they fall into, because that's the first opportunity that you get on that pillar slide that talks about, where we could tie those case studies in to those pillars, because how many policies are made as a result of a mistake or misconduct, right? That's usually how policy is made in the department, because someone made a mistake or someone did some type of misconduct. But you get to explain, the pillars and how, each one of those is equally important, and they're really all about preventing harm, and that's the big thing, right? Mistakes happen. We're human. That's how we kind of learn. Misconduct, on the other hand, hey, you know what? That could be part of a mistake, or it could be some type of misinterpretation. But sometimes misconduct is done on purpose. And health and wellness could be a contributing factor in both mistakes and misconduct. So that incorporates all aspects of our lives, both at home and at work. And this is really the opportunity where you could really start to tie back into those case studies. So as we move on to some of the other successful bystandership programs, we get to talk a little bit about, that very first bystander program. And, it's funny because when I talk to recruits about ABLE, and I talk about, like, hey, what was the first, successful peer intervention program that happened in this country, right? And 1983 was the first one. It was like, what the heck? What, 1983? These kids weren't even born yet. But you do get to play that game, especially when you're doing in service, and you get some of the older officers there to try and have them give an idea and try and pull it out of them first, because you get some interesting answers when they start thinking about it, because they don't go all the way back to 1983, which was the real first successful one. The friends don't let friends drive drunk. So that really shifted the focus, right? From not to the offender to take care of himself, but to the passengers and friends, right? The bystanders to intervene. So as we move into the other successful bystandership programs, to get those pictures up there, I always like to point out when I'm doing the class is that blue bar on the bottom, right? That large group discussion bar on the bottom, or it could say table team activity on the bottom, but whatever it says on the bottom, in the very first one that you come to, I always like to point it out, because that really prompts the participants in the class to kind of get ready for a discussion, for them to actually participate in something. So I really like to point that out to them, because this is where we're going to start to shift of us talking to having the class talk. And eventually we're going to get to that 20-80 rule, right? Where we're only contributing 20% of the conversation, and the participants are going to be contributing 80% of the conversation as we move further into the program. So, we play that game. Hey, what's this a picture of, right? It's always good to start like that, because the first one is very easy. They usually get it right away, right? And we talk about the problems that might exist, or the consequences that might occur if someone was doing something wrong and that nobody was intervening. Of course, the biggest cost of a mistake in the airline industry is death, right? And we all know that, and how problems needed to be addressed. And I like to talk about how, law enforcement is kind of late to the party in this active bystandership, because you had that first successful one back in the early 80s. The airline industries have been doing it well before that too, because of all the issues they had with plane crashes. So they've been doing it a long time. When you talk about, drunk pilots, pilot fatigue, and then, the mistakes and how the co-pilot, didn't correct it. And you have that rank structure that you could talk about. So these are all the things that you kind of want to talk about with the participants, and try and pull that information out of them, especially when you start to talk about the parallels to law enforcement, right? So you talk about the industry, you kind of get them to give you an idea of what it is, talk about what the parallels to law enforcement are, you talk about that hierarchical structure in the airline industry, and similar to law enforcement. And then you talk about, so that people sometimes will bring out is that, hey, that cockpit kind of looks like a cruiser, setting where you got two people working together, close proximity, and working close together all the time, and some of the issues that have that. And then you can always tie this back to the case studies, and you ask which case study that it might remind you of. And then you get to the next picture, you talk about the operating room, right? And the same questions might arise, and what the problems might be. What consequences might occur if someone was doing something wrong in the operating room if no one would intervene. Same type of discussion that goes on here. Talk about doctors that make mistakes. What kind of mistakes do they make in the operating room? Whether they, they do surgery on the wrong organ, or take out the wrong extremity, leave tools within the body, and how it's a high stress structure, and some of the rank structures that are associated with the operating room and who's in charge. And here's where you get to bring up that gender issue that Greg was talking about too. Like when you talk about that, I always like to say, hey, when you think about a surgeon, who do you think of the surgeon, right? And that's where you can start bringing up some of the issues with gender. And because when you tie this back into your cases, you go right back to the Lopez case, right? Where Greg had mentioned that earlier. And, you talk a little bit about, malpractice in the medical field and how did that compare to law enforcement, where, doctors and nurses and all have a duty to care for the patient. And likewise, we have a duty to care for the public, right? We have to protect and serve the public. And if you breach that duty, what happens? Something bad can happen. And what we call that in our field is a violation of public trust, right? When we violate the public trust, there's some bad things that can happen. And then you can also talk about the damage to the profession that occurs as a result of any type of mistake or bad things that happen within the medical field. One thing I also like to bring up in this particular industry is that I remember reading an article in Police Magazine, Police One Magazine, and it talked about this. It was a sergeant from Colorado, and I one of my colleagues from Colorado had told me, oh, that's my sergeant that mentioned that article. And he was going in for surgery at a local hospital. And while he was there, usually when you go in for surgery, your medical team comes in and they kind of talk to you. Your surgeon comes in, your anesthesiologist comes in, and then the nurses are in there, and they're all talking about the procedure, making sure that they're all going to be doing the right thing. And then before they actually, brought him to the operating room, he heard the team talk about, hey, listen, if you see me doing something different that I'm not supposed to be doing, make sure you let me know. And he said, hey, wait a minute, you're talking about this able thing. That's what we're doing now, peer intervention, making sure that we're all together, not making mistakes. So he was, it was quite a great article to read when we're talking about that in the medical field. And then, of course, the last one is always the hardest one for some people to kind of figure out what that is. But we know that, it's the college campus, and we talked there about, preventing sexual assault and how there's that informal hierarchy within the college campuses and the fraternities and sororities and how to try and influence that culture, that no longer boys will be boys type of thing is going to be tolerated. And that by saying nothing, you're actually condoning the activity. And once again, you refer that back to law enforcement. Where could that happen in law enforcement? The reputation of all these three industries is at risk. Does anybody want to send their kids to a college with high rates of sexual assault? Do you want to have surgery in a hospital that has a lot of malpractice that kills patients? And you want to fly airlines that's known for crashes, right? You bring all that stuff up in the discussions that can happen in this particular section. Likewise, I like to say is that, just like the profession of these industries that don't want to have the public, fly those airlines or go to those hospitals, the public does not want to be policed by agencies that are making a lot of mistakes or carrying out a lot of misconduct if it's not being looked at. In the end, I like to say that most people want to do the right thing, but they need the skill to recognize the need for intervention and the strategies and effective ways to do it. And that's why we move on from here to talk a little bit about that and how we get those skills and strategies to do the right thing. Greg, back to you.
Awesome.
Into social science.
Appreciate that, Phil. And those two things that you mentioned at the very end, it's important because that really helps to shape that segment and why we're late to the game, so to speak, right? And then also, in general, what people should be doing and who they are. Generally speaking, people want to do the right things, and generally speaking, they do, but there are inhibitors and things that get in the way. And that kind of gives us a great transition into this next segment here, which is social science. This is actually one of my favorite sections because I like to have a little bit of fun. Now, I know that all instructors are not always in that space of having fun when it comes to something like science, but I have this inner nerd thing going on. So for me, this is kind of cool. So I'm not going to do anything deep into this segment here because actually our learning module number 1 or learning session number 1, we had Joel and Abigail do a deep dive into the social science experiment. So they go into great detail about these. So if you have a moment, if you haven't looked at it already, when you get into the instructor portal, go into learning sessions and look at learning session number 1, and it is a deep dive. So I'm just going to do kind of just a high level touch on each one of these. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but here's a couple of important things to remember when it comes to social science experiment. And I always like to tell instructors and students that most of instructors that look at the 30,000 foot view of these experiments. And the 30,000 foot view of these experiments is noted in 2 slides before the experiments, where the students are actually defining the 2 types of bystandership, active and passive. And by defining the 2 types of bystandership, it gives your students a better understanding of how people behave under those 2 elements and what other factors are introduced into their decision-making process when an event occurs. So that's really just kind of the 30,000 foot view of this and how you enter into these experiments. The other thing too is there's a preamble page when you get into the social science experiment that I think is important for students to make sure that they read. And part of what the preamble into this talks about research behind group violence, and research behind group violence shows learning by doing that without inhibiting forces such as active bystanders. Once violence begins, individuals and groups change, and there is an evolution of increasing harm doing. So in other words, doing nothing increases harm doing. So if you think about those dynamics going into the experiments, it really helps you to be able to deliver them and understand what the intention is, and the intentionality is rather, behind these experiments and what we're looking at as we look at active and passive bystanders. So let's look at the first social science experiment, which is the Darling-Latané. And the biggest thing to start off with here, and this one is a little complex, it takes a little bit to set this one up. So it's important that you really look at the facilitator's guide and then use this social science supplement as some foundation. But one of the biggest things here that the researchers wanted to walk away with is this group size impacts one likelihood of helping. So just keep that in the back of your mind. And one of the things that I tell students to do when they're starting to study the social science experiment is maybe perhaps consider starting at the end, which is the learning objectives. What are you trying to accomplish? Where are you trying to get your students to? What are the key takeaways that you want them to learn from this particular experiment? Once you kind of know that, then go back and start practicing and understanding the setup. And the 2 key terms here that you want your students to learn and to get out of this is diffusion responsibility. Someone else is going to do it. And then pluralistic ignorance, where it's believed that no one else seems to think that there's anything wrong, so everything must be okay. Now, I actually talked about these 2 things when I was talking about the Lopez case study, and the facilitator guide in your key learning objectives actually kind of make a notation. Well, not kind of, it does make a notation, and it connects to the Officer Lopez case study. Now, you can connect this to a couple other case studies. You can open it up for discussion, but this does directly connect to the Lopez case study. And in the Lopez case study, you do have some diffusion responsibility and pluralistic ignorance, because in the case study, you have all of these people that are there, including someone of rank, and no one's doing anything about what's happening. And so this is a great, great illustration in connection to that case study. Now, at the end of all of these social science experiments, and this one in particular, there's a certain cadence to it, right? So you deliver the case study, you deliver the social science experiment, you go through the process of getting into the reasoning. So that's the percentages. That's where you have a little bit of fun with it. And you have them compete with each other a little bit over the reasoning. Then you get into the key terms or the learning objectives, which you see here on your screen now. And then the last part of the cadence is kind of a 2-part process. Connection to law enforcement. So how does this connect? Do we see diffusion responsibility and pluralistic ignorance in law enforcement? And if we do, and if they can say that they do, then where do you see it? How does it show up? Where do you normally see these type of dynamics happening? And then the facilitator guide points you to connection to case study. So each one of these will always have a connection to case study. And this one has the connection to the Lopez case study. So that is experiment number 1, Darling-Latané. Let's go to experiment number 2. This is another one that is one of my favorites of the social science experiment. I kind of do this one at executive sessions. I have fun with this one because this is at a seminary school, Princeton Seminary School. And so most people say, wow, seminarians are supposed to be a certain kind of way. And we realize as we talk about the 2 different things of active and passive bystanders, even seminarians struggle with actually helping someone that's in distress. So here's a couple key takeaways with this one. This one speaks specifically to sensory exclusion from being in a hurry. Now, in law enforcement, how many times have we been in a hurry? Another way to kind of talk about sensory exclusion is also tunnel vision, right? So being in a hurry makes you less likely to stop for help, and being in a hurry makes you less likely to recognize that help is needed. And of course, as I just mentioned, we call that sensory exclusion. And so that's the key takeaway here. That's the key learning objective. And in the facilitator's guide, this one will actually connect back to the Lopez case study as well. And it specifically talks about in the Lopez case study, how many people probably noticed her mental state and things that were happening with her, but they were too busy and they were focusing on themselves or focusing on their task at hand. And it wasn't until something bad that happened that they started to pay attention. Now, again, you can connect this to other case studies. If your students decide, I don't know, think that the Lopez, I think that the Jensen case study would fit well here. Well, there's a couple key takeaways there from the Jensen case study that connects with sensory exclusion. So it absolutely works because it's working within confines of the design of the curriculum. So that is in a nutshell, the Darley and Batson case, social science experiment number 2. Let's go to social science experiment number 3. This one, the Milgram experiment. Another one of my favorite ones. This one has a lot of moving parts to it. So it does take a little bit of time to set this up. And one of the first things that I will tell students and I would tell instructors in our trainer class is don't try to take on the entire experiment and deliver it all in one shot. So what I mean by that is build in some pause points. So for instance, as you set up the first part of this experiment, kind of pause and maybe reach out to the class and say, okay, so everybody's tracking what's going on here. And then go back to the setup of the experiment. Then maybe do that a second time as you get midway through. And it really just kind of checks to make sure that your students are really still locked in. But you as an instructor, it also helps you to be able to process the sequence of order in which you're delivering the experiment. So nice little nugget here to just kind of throw out there. And the learning objective here is the influence of rank. Authority figures have a significant power over the actions of people who are or who they think are under their command. In the Milgram experiment, obviously, as you see there in the picture, you have a gentleman in the gray lab coat. Not a lot of expression comes from his face, very strong demeanor, clean cut, looks like a person that's in authority. And that authority figure influences the situation. Well, how many authority figures have significant power to action people in law enforcement? Your students and you as instructors can probably identify a lot of different situations. And even if you are instructed as of rank, you can probably identify yourself. Because guess what? Even as a commander, I can identify myself being in a position of authority, having significant power. And with that power, sometimes the influence in which you have can impact what someone else do or what someone else doesn't do. So this is a great important thing to make sure that you deliver in the key learning objectives. And then the tie-in this one is to the Sergeant McDonald case study. The facilitator's guide will direct you to that particular one. And specifically, the facilitator guide directs you as facilitators to think about the rank structure, how that plays a role and how that plays a role in the failure to intervene. And again, you can also connect this to any one of the other case studies as well, but this one specifically connects into the Sergeant McDonald case study. Okay, and then we'll go to the last case study, and that is the Ervin Staub experiment. This one is pretty good. I like this one as well. This one is kind of fun, but again, you got to remember the sequence of events. Again, I'm not going to go into super detail because we got that in learning session module number 1, but here's the key takeaways with this one. This one is unlike experiment number 3, where experiment number 3 talks about the influence of rank. This one is about the influence of engaging allies, right? So this is more about the influence that someone has and someone might do something. So we tell people in the classroom, think about the time when you had to go through training for CPR. And let's just say it's two law enforcement professionals. What is one person doing? What is the other person doing? Well, one person says, hey, you go call 911, or you jump on the radio, or hey, you go get the IED, I go do this. Well, this experiment really dives into that. And that's really the setup of this one. It's really about the influence of engaging allies or listening allies. And so that is this one in a nutshell. Again, this experiment is fun as well, just like the other ones, but this ties in also to all of the case studies. So what you will say in this one is that which one of the 3 case studies does this you think kind of aligns with this, or something along those lines. You don't have to say it in that specific order. And there's a tie-in to any one of the case studies, because all 3 of the case studies you can see happening in this social science experiment. And of course, the connection to your learning objectives is simply that there is no such thing as neutral. Bystanders have a significant power over the actions of other bystanders by defining the situation, by defining the expected action or response. So in other words, action breeds action and inaction breeds inaction. And I also like to tie this particular social science experiment to the video that they will watch after lunch, which is the Mo Cheeks video. The Mo Cheeks video really shows this social science experiment live, because in the Mo Cheeks video, you have 20,000 people, right? You have Mo Cheeks come in, not be in a position of neutral. His actions breeded actions of 20,000 plus people that were in that arena, and really helped Nellie Gilbert, who was singing the national anthem. And you all are familiar with that video. So that is the social science experiment. It's a couple small things in terms of guidance that I want to just convey before I turn this over to Phil to get into inhibitors. Couple things. Again, remember, make sure that you tie it into examples of policing and make that discussion organic. Remember, at the bottom of the screen there, Phil talked about it, you have that little indicator that says large group discussion. So as a part of the large group discussion, you want to be able to build in some examples of policing. Now, when I say examples of policing, where you actually see the social science experiment playing out in law enforcement profession. This is not an area where you start to get into storytelling about war stories, okay? You want to try to make that connection to policing and what the law enforcement profession experience as it relates to active and passive bystanders. Again, remembering that there's a tie in to case studies with each 4 of the social science experiments. You want to make sure to visualize the experiments. Now, sometimes folks will just say, I'm a visual person, Greg and Phil. In order for me to understand this, I need to make it visual. So, hey, maybe practice doing this on a whiteboard. If you have that luxury there, you can draw it out. You can set it up. You can use students and props. I oftentimes will use students as props. I find that to be extremely effective in the classroom, and it keeps students engaged, and it keeps them feeling like, especially the ones that I use as props, it lets them feel like they're a part of it. And all of a sudden now they forget about the science part of it, and they really get to feel that humanality to it. And then, of course, make sure that you're getting participation. I often tell students I love sitting in silence. So usually if I ask a question, I'm not necessarily going to answer my question, because I want that engagement. So invite engagement. And at the end of the day, have fun with these experiments. All right, I'm going to turn this over to Phil, who's going to talk about inhibitors. Phil?
Oh, great. Thank you, Greg. And as you get into, the inhibitors and what are the inhibitors, this is where you're going to end up having to break them out into small groups. Team table, you can go to the next slide for a minute. And I point out at the bottom of the next slide, table team activity gets them into the mindset that they're going to be broken up into a small group. This is, I think, the second one that they do. And, have a conversation about these 2 questions right here. And, give them some time to do that, about 10 minutes or so, and then have them come back into the room. So, Greg made a point about, if you have a whiteboard, if you have a huge whiteboard, it's great. If not, maybe those big big white Post-it notes that they have available to write people's answers down. One of the things I found is that when the group comes back and you start getting the answers from the groups, if you could write them down on the whiteboard or on those big Post-it notes. And then one thing I find that you shouldn't do afterwards is like, and once you're all done, say, okay, and then erase everything. Don't want to erase it. You want to leave it up if you can, if you have that, extra space on the whiteboard. Because I think it deflates people that after they go out and put time into this discussion and come back and give you the answers, and you take the time to write it down, and then you erase it, it kind of deflates them a little bit. So, and it also helps keep engaged for the rest of the day, because then you can always go back and to refer to these answers that people have given you throughout the day. And it really makes them feel a little special because you're referring back to their particular answer. And this section here is really going to be driven by the conversations that you have with the participants and, what answers they give to you. because as we come up to the next slide, you're not only going to discuss their answers, but you're going to talk about what the experts have to say and compare, the answers that the groups come up with to the answers that the experts had come up with. And a lot of times, many of the answers are going to be pretty much coincide with what the experts say. And then you could also give examples from your own career, from your own experience. And at the end of all this discussion, you talk a little bit about saying that, at the end of the day, the best person to help an officer is another officer, because we have the same ideas, the same feelings, the same interactions. And that, if people try to tend to say, hey, it ain't going to work, you can emphasize that you don't know how someone's going to react and respond unless we do try it. And like I said, here you also talk a little bit about those experiments, got the diffusion responsibility and pluralistic ignorance again that come into that. Talk about not my job. And then the next slide talks about other potential inhibitors also. And this is where you can really, bring in some of your own examples. Or if you're looking to really have a discussion with people, you can ask them, you can ask the participants, what does this particular sentence mean to them? What does it mean when you want the wrongdoer to face consequences, or you fear that the leadership is not going to support you, or what the lack of empathy might be? And that's how you can get more people to kind of have the conversation. So this whole section, these 3 slides here that you talk about inhibitors, is really all about you enticing the conversation between the participants and how it relates back to ABLE. And so depending upon how good of a conversationalist you are, is going to be how good this conversation is going to be. So you got to really practice that a little bit. Have some of those ideas in mind from your own experiences to be able to start the conversation. And as soon as some person starts to talk, other people will start to talk too. So that will jump into brain science, because that's kind of a tough one to talk about, because you really have to know this. And Greg's gonna talk a little bit about the brain science piece.
Yes, thanks a lot, Phil. Yeah, so brain science. Wow. So another segment here that I sometimes often see some of the instructors not necessarily embrace. Some absolutely love it, but some are like, man, we're talking about science, we're talking about psychology here. Oh, this is not an area that I'm very strong in. Well, couple key things with this we'll talk about here in a second that really make this easy, because what brain science is talking about is what our human body does and how we react to different things that we encounter, and how important that becomes a little bit later on as we start the process of implementing some of the ABLE framework. I'm not going to go deeply into this one, because like the other one in social science experiments, we actually have a learning session on this one. So learning session number 4, when you go on instructor portal, go into learning sessions. Learning session number 4 does a deep dive into brain science. So I'm just going to do a very high level touch on this particular segment. And remembering that in this segment, this is where we start to get into the meat and potatoes of ABLE. This is when we start to talk about when and how I intervene. That's what this segment is. This is where you start to introduce the framework here in different situations and scenarios. And just before you get to the brain science, you're going to actually introduce the 3 steps of ABLE, which is notice, decide, and act. And then you'll start to talk about what shapes the 2 aspects that shapes our awareness, which is people and the situation. And so brain science focuses on yourself and others, the people. So here's a couple key takeaways with this one. You have a nice little video in this one, and this video helps to set you up nicely. The video comes right after this. And so the key thing here is you want to talk about yourself and others. We all bring positive aspects to everything that we do. We bring our experience, our values, our beliefs, our skills, our loyalty to justice, to the community. These are all the fantastic things that we always bring in every situation. But when we're under stress, when we're under situations that get us into a heightened state of emotion, it just all becomes unraveled. This slide, even though it doesn't have one of those little tickers in the bottom left-hand corner of the slide for large group discussion, I find myself and and also other instructors and the trainers when they're teaching this back, they use this particular one as a small discussion point. That is perfectly fine, because that helps to soften the science part of this a little bit and really get people focused into themselves and noticing what's happening in others. How, if they're getting into a heightened state of emotion, how you can identify the earliest possible stages that they are in a heightened state of emotion. The other thing that's important about this segment that gets introduced, and it's really kind of a slogan, is that time based intervention framework, where we start to talk about before the event, early in the event, later in the event, and after the event. And the slogan is as early as best, but never late than never. That is the first time that they will see it. And then you segue into this. And then there is a video that happens right after this. And that video really kind of takes a lot of the things that you have to explain. Really, everything that comes after that video about brain science is things that you're reinforcing from the video. So a couple key takeaways on this one is this diagram right here really talks about how the amygdala works, right? The amygdala rapidly activate that fight, flight, or freeze. Now, we do get a lot of instructors that can't say amygdala just because they're just trying to make sure to pronounce it right. The facilitator guide does give you phonetic spelling of it or pronunciation of it rather, but it still sometimes trips folks up because they're trying so hard to remember to say amygdala that they forget everything else. And then they don't even try to say mammalian, right? Because they're so focused on amygdala. Listen, you don't have to get so caught up in the terminology because the video that plays actually helps to lay this out, actually helps to say this for you. And this is just really a reinforcement slide. So the biggest thing that you want to remember is talking about that part of the brain that is the emotional traffic controller, i.e. or e.g. the amygdala. And that rapidly activates the fight, flight, or freeze response when there's some type of perceived danger. So that's the main thing that you want to make sure that you convey. And here's another little small nugget about this that I like to just kind of point out. And this is really just a very simplistic way without even having to say amygdala. That blue part that you see there, I like to tell students, hey, listen, think about your brain this way. That blue part is the thinking part of your brain, right? That's your cap. That's your lid. And the green part is where you start to get into the emotional part of the brain. And if you break that down in that small little area, that amygdala, that's that air traffic controller or the emotional controller of your emotions. And when you're in a heightened state of emotion, and that analogy, excuse me, that people flip their lid, right? They were so mad they flipped their lid. They're now not in their thinking brain, they're in their emotional brain. So a nice little quick nugget to just kind of throw out there for this to kind of make it pretty simple. You want to, as you progress into this, get into audience participation with this one. And as a part of that, as you see there, as far as large group discussion. So here's a couple things I like to do with this particular one. You first start off, you talk about, what am I feeling? What is happening to me in a hijack situation? When I'm in a heightened state of emotion, what's happening to me? And you ask that question. And when you ask that question, your students are going to say, oh yeah, rapid heartbeat, adrenaline rush, they're going to feel all types of things. So they're going to already talk about the bullet points that you're going to get ready to reveal right now, right? It's like, yes, you experienced adrenaline rush. Hey, you just hit it right on the head. Rapid heartbeat, auditory exclusion, time distortion, perceptual narrowing. And here's another little nugget I like to kind of add into this segment here. When I'm delivering this segment, I like to try to connect some of these bullet points to what law enforcement professionals experience. So sometimes I might make a connection to an officer that's been in an officer-involved shooting. Most officers that have been in an officer-involved shooting often describe time distortion, where everything seems to slow down for them, right? I also talk about rapid heartbeat and breathing, because a lot of times in a foot pursuit or when you're going lights and sirens to a call for service, you experience that rapid heartbeat, that rapid rate, especially if it's a shots fired call, it's a big call, you're experiencing a little bit of that. For those who are in the law enforcement profession that are on the non-sport side or civilian side, and I'll just use, let's say, dispatchers, for instance, dispatchers will often experience adrenaline rush when someone is screaming on the phone or someone's in a stressful situation. They will experience rapid heart rate and breathing. They will experience auditory exclusion. So know your audience, know the room. You may have some civilian that are there mixed in with sworn. And collectively in law enforcement, no matter where you work, you could experience these things. Even outside of work, you may experience these things in your personal life. Sometimes I give the analogy of someone coming up from behind you, like a kid or one of your kids or somebody, and they scare you, you can probably check off maybe 4 of these things when someone scares you or startles you, because you'll get that adrenaline rush, that rapid heart rate, that auditory exclusion, because your body is doing the natural thing that it's designed to do. So that's one of the things that I like to talk about in this particular segment. And that's where you get that audience participation. Also, you get audience participation here where you start to talk about what are those indicators. So if we know that your body gets into a certain space and is doing some things kind of autonomously in a fight, flight, or freeze situation, then what are the indicators that you're experiencing that? And again, it goes to these bullet points here. That's where you're engaging with the students, you're getting them to give you some feedback, intense reaction to mild stimuli, mood swings, big emotional reactions, lack of sleep, hypervigilance. And you'll notice that I'm not hitting on every single one of these bullet points. You probably shouldn't just be talking about each one of the bullet points, because your students are going to identify these already. So hit on a few that they haven't identified, or you can expound on a few of them to broaden the level of the discussion. Also, you'll start to get into talking about what can I do to self-calm. So after you go to the segment of what you're feeling in a hijack and what the indicators are, another group discussion and engagement is what do you do for self-harm? So this is where you kind of get into that personal space a little bit. So what do you do to self-calm yourself? Do you go fishing? Do you go to the gym? Do you play video games? What is it that you do? And you foster that discussion. This is really an organic discussion that you'll have in this particular portion of it. Then as you start to progress through this segment, then you start to get into breathing, or what we call box breathing. You may hear that a lot. And the breathing is important because in order to get your mind and your brain back into this cap, or back into the thinking portion of the brain, you have to go through some breathing exercises. And in those breathing exercises, that helps to get the oxygen to the brain. So you want to cover this segment here. And what we often do is we'll actually get students to stand up and we will actually have them demonstrate breathing. And of course, as instructor, you kind of walk them through. It doesn't take no longer than about 3 to 4 minutes to do, but it's also a great little technique to do after, because this is after lunch and it gets everyone moving. It gets the oxygen to the brain, because usually after lunch, things start to slow down a little bit in your teaching. So it's great to get them to get up, practice doing those quality breaths, getting that oxygen to the brain so that they can, in a heightened state of emotion, you can think a little bit clearly. All right, so the next part of this, after you look at yourself and others, then you start to look at the situation. What are the situations and triggers that get you into a heightened state of emotion? So this is another segment that's important. And so large group discussion, you'll see there and there at the left-hand corner. And you ask your students, what are some situational triggers? What are some things that you know will get you into the heightened state of emotion and get you into a space where you can experience an amygdala hijack? And so you get them to identify it, and then you reveal some of the bullet points of this segment. So they're going to identify some of these already. So you got foot pursuits, you got heightened periods on the job, you got members of the community that are challenging your authority. We get a lot of folks that will talk about the type of call. Sometimes something may have happened to you from a primary, secondary trauma standpoint. And so you might get emotional responses. You might have an emotional response to a certain type of call. And some of those emotional responses are some of the examples in the bullet points there. So an officer down call, or that alert tone, or something happening to animals, or domestic violence situation, or harm to children. Most of the time, your students are going to identify some of these. I always like to kind of emphasize this, because I think no matter how many calls for service you go on, or whether how many calls you're dispatching on, no matter how many calls that you're helping to process on, or a situation you're helping to process on, you could, or someone could, experience some type of trigger from a number of different things. So by identifying these situational triggers, it helps your students to identify the thing that drove them into that heightened state of emotion, or that amygdala in the first place. As you progress through that, then you start to talk about what might motivate harmful action. Now, I have had some students and instructors ask, well, Greg, Phil, why do we cover this, right? Why do we talk about what might motivate some type of harmful action? Well, earlier in the curriculum, we actually identify what are some motivations to intervene to stop harm, right? So if we know what those motivators are to intervene to stop harm, it's also important that we talk about what might motivate some type of harmful action. If we know what those motivators are, we know that when people get into a heightened state of emotion and they get an amygdala hijack and they're not in their thinking brain, it could be a situation where it puts them into doing more harmful action, not just in an event of to someone else, but to themselves as well, right? They may not be well. In a Jensen case study, he was putting himself in a very bad situation because he was very fatigued. I just gave you all a nice little case study connection there, but in that particular situation, he was very fatigued. So you foster some discussion, get some responses, and then of course you reveal the bullet points here. And some of the bullet points here is perception that your authority is being challenged, generalized and harmful behavior of individuals, the evaluation of certain groups, trauma-induced reactivity, being overly sensitive to the behavior of civilians and to the interventions by colleagues. So again, this is a very important segment here because this is all the setup for some of the framework that you're introducing. First set of framework is the 3 steps of Able. And then it helps you to set up for the next set of framework, which is the 3Ds. And I'm going to turn this over to Phil, who's going to cover the 3Ds.
Great, thanks, Greg. Yeah, it is important to talk about those situational triggers. Just a quick story, because we recently had a discussion with the class, and we're talking about situational triggers and what might trigger somebody. And the discussion came up about spitting, getting spit at, and how people would react to that. And during the discussion, some people in the class, kind of old school kind of officers, would say, "Well, I just, hit them." That deserves a hit, and that's disgusting. But then we talked about it. What can you do, right? What can you really do when someone spits at you? You really can't go, aggressive at them. You have to really have the appropriate response to that. And we talked about that. And not more than a week later, that same officer had texted me and said, "Hey, guess what?" I said, "What?" He says, "Some guy just spit at me." I says, "And I didn't punch him out." So I said, "That was a good thing we discussed it in class." So it's really good to have those situational triggers talked about and really formulate that opinion as to what you're going to do that you can legally do and not get in trouble, right? So we can talk about the 3Ds, right? Remember, there's no distinct order in how they're to be done. They're all different approaches. It's not a process. So as it comes up on the next slide, it shows the little circle there of direct, distract, and delegate. You don't have to go in that order, and that you can use them together or you can use them separately. So if you go to the next slide, right after that, and your first one we're going to talk about is distract. And this is where, once again, that large group discussion comes up in the bottom. I've already triggered my participants that they're going to be a discussion here, right? We talk a little bit about what does it mean to distract? What do they think it means to distract? And really, you can do, what you're trying to do is you're trying to break that heightened emotional intensity, right? What can we do to distract somebody to break that heightened sense of emotional intensity that's going on? We need to refocus that person's attention somewhere else. Usually at this point, I try to make it a little funny. And I say, "Yeah, look at the bird in the tree," right? And that kind of, right then and there, I'm like breaking that. Oh, what are we talking about here, right? Give them that little break of intensity of the classroom, and then go back to talking a little bit about this. And then you go right back to the case studies, right? "Hey, Sarge, can you go tell them, we go call the Sarge to Jensen, right? Hey, can you tell them that we need the sergeant over here? Or maybe, I need some help. Can you come over here and do that to the Lopez case," right? There's all kinds of tie-ins that you can go back to those case studies and have that discussion in this particular slide. Then you go to the next one, which is delegate. And this is where sometimes, some of the people confuse this a little bit. The delegation is really inviting somebody, right? We're inviting somebody, we're inviting an ally, and we're delegating that intervention to that particular person who might be in a better position to intervene. It could be a rank thing, right? It could be that, maybe it's a supervisor that is in a better position to do the intervention, or maybe it's going to be a friend of that officer who has a close relationship with them that can step in. Once again, you can use the case studies to show how you can delegate that intervention. Maybe in the McDonald case, you say to one of the rookies, "Hey, why don't you go over there and practice handcuffing so that you can practice that, because you need more work in handcuffing, right? So those are some of the things that you can do. This is where you can also bring in the experiments to show how delegation works. And that's on Staub's experiment, where he says, hey, if you do this, I'm going to do this, right? Once again, it's delegating that intervention to somebody else. And then direct, right? And this one is the most straightforward of them all. And it could be challenging, it could be uncomfortable a little bit, but you're basically giving a command or an order, right? You're voicing your concern. Here you could bring up the Portland video, right? And talk a little bit about that. It was quick, it was decisive, and it was done. And what would direct intervention look like in some of those case studies? Once again, you go back to those case studies and you bring that into the large group discussion. Once again, these large group discussions are all about you and your ability to drive that conversation. If you ever get stuck, those case studies, the experiments, anything that we talked to up until this point is now be talked about in these large group discussions as we talk about these 3Ds. And then from here, we're going to get into the PAC model, right? And ways that we can intervene, especially when there's rank involved. And Greg's going to jump on this one.
Yep. So we got two more quick portions of this, and then we'll be wrapping up the learning session here. So just want to let the audience know we're towards the end of the curriculum and have two more quick things to hit. So the PAC model. This is the last portion of framework that you're going to be demonstrating and rolling out to your students. And of course, when we look at our time-based framework, we are at later in the event in this one. And so this one simply is probe, alert, silence, take action. And of course, on this particular slide is where you start to talk about how effective this intervention model is, and about rank being an inhibitor. So you kind of set the stage here. And this is where you start to talk a little bit about Korean Flight 801 and what happened in dynamics there, and how the airline industry and the medical industry adopted, some of the challenges that they had. And one of the two of the biggest things that they had problems with, or issues with, or challenges with, was the issue of rank. And so if we go to the next slide, you start to get engagement from the class here, where you actually pull up these slides. Now, here's the thing to note about this particular section here. There's no small indicator in the lower left-hand side that says large group discussion, but the facilitated guide does direct you to have students read this out loud. Sometimes I notice that some instructors will kind of forget that piece, and they think that they're the ones who have to read, probe, alert, challenge, take action. So this is a great small, brief engagement point. You want to direct this out to your students. And you can reveal them one at a time, or you can reveal all three of them, but nonetheless, have a different student read each one, right? And so this is a conversation between the pilot and the co-pilot. And this is how we start to progress through PAC. And so this is also a great way to get folks that have not been engaging all day engaged. So have them read. And I might just randomly go around the room. I don't even say, hey, someone volunteer to read number one, the first one, probe. I'll just call on someone. I'll say, hey, Phil, read probe for me. Hey, Lindy, read alert for me. And I'll have them read it out loud. Now, the clear thing that you want to make here, and in connection you want to make here is you want to ask the class, what is it that they notice about this conversation? They should start to identify certain things like, oh, the conversation gets progressively urgent. They should also maybe identify that, hey, it goes from formal to informal. And that's exactly where you want to lead them to, because you want to be able to illustrate the difference between the C of challenge and T, take action, where it goes from captain to Tom. So that's a clear distinction that you want to make sure that they notice that the difference in the examples, and having them read that out loud. And then as you start to go through this, here's another quick thing that I like to do is you see the first one is a probe, right? I believe these storms are colliding. Why are we attempting to fly through them? Question mark. So I start that process of letting them know what each letter is. So probe is a question. Alert is something that you are observing. You're noticing something that's happening. Challenge is really a probe with an alert, right? So it's kind of a question, but I'm alerting you of something, and there could be consequences associated with it. And take action is just that, it's take action. And so then on the next slide, I actually put this into practice. So you want to have your class put this into practice. Now you do see large group activity. And what you want to do is you want to show examples of each one. So what I typically do, and what your facilitated guide kind of prompts you to do, is maybe use one of the case studies. So I might say, all right, class, let's look at the Lopez case study. How would you probe Officer Lopez? What would you say to her? How would you probe her? And then you get that engagement, and then you progress through to alert, challenge, take action in the same manner. You can even break it up. You can just use one case study for probe and alert, use another case study for challenge and take action. However you decide to do it in a moment works absolutely fine. But the cadence of this is making sure that you use examples and have your students engage in showing examples what a probe, an alert, challenge, and a take action is. You also want to make sure to emphasize that sometimes you might not have enough time in each one of the steps. So you can also point them to the Seattle video. In the Seattle video, you did not see a probe or challenge, or I'm sorry, a probe alert or challenge. It went straight to take action because there may not have been time. The urgency and the exigency of the circumstance dictated that that other officer, that backup officer, moved the knee off the neck and went straight to take action. So you want to make sure that you emphasize those 2 points. And that's really the PAC model here. I'm going to turn this over to Phil, and he's going to go over the last portion of this, which is role plays, because this is also another important aspect as you start to wrap up the curriculum.
And this is actually one of the most challenging, I think, for the participants, because we know how much officers like to role play when they come to in-service. So you really, this could really make or break the rest of the, the last part of the day. And one of the things that I would suggest is that, you know what, only use those 2-person role plays. There are several in the book, but only use those 2-person role plays. I will stay away from the protest one because, and that was talking from experience, because we did do a protest one time, and it kind of got out of hand a little bit where there was some pushing and shoving. We almost had to say, oh, stop. You really had to facilitate that. So I would use the behavioral changes, rules of the road, and falsifying the report, right? So the other thing is you want to make sure you pick your role players, right? You pick the people that you know will do a decent job with it, that won't screw it up. You know who those people are. You know the people in your classrooms that are jokesters, maybe disgruntled a little bit, that may not be participating. You don't want to use those people because it will ruin the whole end of the day, right? If you pick the wrong role players, it will derail the end of the day for you. And what I found is that I like to set up my role play and set the scene for the entire class. Usually I'll pick my role players like during lunchtime, and I kind of give them a heads up that these are the people that I want to use. And I say, hey, listen, do you mind being a role player? And what I also do is I print out the particular sections, the particular roles that these players are going to have, and I give them to them just before they're getting ready to do their role play. And what I also do is I found that when I set the scene for everybody, and then the role players start acting out their roles, that the rest of the participants in the class really don't know what's going on. They're trying to figure out what these 2 role players have going on in their lives. So what I did to kind of compensate for that was I would give the 2 role players their particular roles. And then after I set the scene for the entire class, including the role players, I would ask the 2 role players to step out of the room and not talk to each other. And then I would describe to the rest of the class what each role player is going through. So now they have an understanding of why these questions are being asked by the role player to the other role player. And they really can understand what's going on in the dynamics of all that role play. And then, once the one other thing is when you're giving them a copy of that, make sure you cut out the part that says that the role play ends when the role player agrees for intervention, because we did that one time. I forgot to take that out. And of course, when they came in to do the role play, the role player said, hey, you should go get help. And the other guy said, yeah, right, I will. And that was the end of the role play. So you know what? We had to make sure we eliminated that part from the handout as we gave it out to them. At the end, of the action sequence where the role players, we've had some really good role players in the past, and at the end, make sure that you acknowledge the fact that they did a good job. And I always start an applause to let them know they did a good job. And then after that's all done, you go into that debriefing, right? The next slide talks about the debriefing. And really, it's important to talk to, what the experience like as being the intervener and what was going through their mind as they were trying to think of some of the questions that they could ask. What did they use? What skills did they use? Did they use the 3Ds? Did they use the PAC model? Those are the types of things you want to find out as to, like, how did you go about that conversation, and what did you start with? Did you start trying to, do some probing questions first, or did you want to You know, did you have to take some action first? What was it that was going through your mind? And then you also talk to the person being intervened upon. What was it like to receive that intervention and be able to get that conversation going so that if they really truly were really playing that role, you get some good conversations at this point. And they talk about how it felt uncomfortable, right? That it wasn't a really good conversation to have, and being able to practice it, right? Just like we practice with our firearms down the range, this role play is really important to practice to be able to make sure that you understand what these skills are and how to implement them. And then also at the end, you also talk to the observers, right? What did you notice? What would you have done different? What kind of questions would you have asked? And really get those observers to get involved too. So you get everybody involved in the role play. And Greg, anything more?
No, I think that's it. I think you covered that beautifully. I think that concludes all of the things I think we wanted to cover today. Lindy, did we miss anything or anything else you think we should double down on?
No, I think that that was great. Thank you so much, Phil and Greg, so much for both of your time and for staying on a little bit longer. This is recorded. It will be posted on our YouTube page. Please feel free to share with your colleagues. Feel free to come back to this in the future before you're about to teach, just as a review. And we just appreciate your time. Thank you for being here. These learning sessions are happening every month. We have another one planned in February and another in March. You'll be getting an email out about both of those in the future. But otherwise, hope you all have a great rest of your week. We'll stick around for a few minutes in case there are any questions. But otherwise, it was good to see you all.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for allowing us to be here today. And Phil, it was great to hang out with you today.
As always, it is mutual.
Yes, as well as you, Lindy. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.